She had walked for 2 days before her legs stopped feeling like they belonged to her. By the time the cabin came into view, she wasn't walking anymore, so much as refusing to fall down. Nora Ashworth stopped at the edge of the yard, looked at the man splitting wood with his back to her, and said the only sentence she had left in her. "Are you Nathaniel Calloway?" The axe came down, buried itself in the stump, and stayed there. He turned around slow, the way a man turns when he already suspects the answer is going to cost him something. "Who's asking?" "My name is Nora Ashworth. My father was Thomas Ashworth." She swallowed. "He told me, before he died, that if I ever needed help in this world and had nowhere left to turn, I should come here. He told me to say 2 words to you, and that you'd understand them better than any explanation I could give." Nate Calloway didn't move. "He said to tell you, Deadman's Crossing." The color went out of the man's face like a lamp turned down low. "If a story like this is pulling you in already, stay with me, because where this one goes, you won't see coming." Nate hadn't heard those 2 words spoken by another living soul in 7 years. He'd said them to himself plenty, in the dead of winter nights when the wind found the cracks in the cabin walls, and the old scar in his hip ached with the cold. Deadman's Crossing, the river ford that earned its name honestly, where the water ran high and mean every spring, where his wagon had overturned in a flash flood 7 years back, where he'd gone under twice and come up once, and would not have come up a second time if a stranger on horseback hadn't ridden his own animal into that current after him. A wiry man with a surveyor satchel still strapped to his back, half drowned himself by the time he dragged Nate onto the bank, coughing up river water and refusing to give his name. He'd only said one thing before he rode off into the rain. Man doesn't get to choose who needs saving. He just chooses whether he stops. Nate had never seen him again, had spent 7 years not knowing who to thank. "Your father," Nate said slowly, "pulled me out of the Snake River in the spring of '61. He told me the story 100 times, Nora said. Every winter, when the fever came back on him and he couldn't sleep, he'd tell it again like it was new. The rancher he never got the name of, the one he always wondered about." Her voice cracked. "He wondered about you for 7 years, Mr. Calloway. And now he's dead, and I'm standing in your yard because I have nowhere left to go. And he told me you were the one man in the territory who might actually help me, instead of using me." Nate's jaw worked. "Using you how?" And that was when Nora Ashworth, 3 weeks an orphan and 2 days off the last of her father's money, told him the truth, because she was too tired to do anything else. Her father had borrowed against their homestead to pay for doctors that never saved him anyway. The loan had come from a man named Josiah Pratt, the richest rancher in 3 counties, a man who owned the bank, half the county council, and, as it turned out, the note on the Ashworth land, which sat squarely over the only spring-fed canyon for 20 miles that never ran dry. When Thomas Ashworth died, Pratt had ridden out to the homestead himself, hat in hand, condolences on his tongue, and an offer underneath them. He'd forgive the debt entirely, in exchange for Nora's hand in marriage. His 3rd wife had died the winter before. He said he admired a woman who could hold a household together through hardship. He said it like a compliment. It had felt like a sentence. "I ran that night," Nora said. "I took my father's letter, and the address in it, and I walked. Because a man like that doesn't forgive a debt, Mr. Calloway. He collects it in whatever coin he wants, and I wasn't going to be his coin." Nate stood in his own yard and felt the quiet, careful life he'd built for himself over 7 years start to come apart at the seams, one thread at a time. He didn't want to help her. He'd built this ranch, this solitude, this whole fortress of a life specifically so that nobody's trouble could ever reach him again. Not after Margaret, not after the boy, not after he'd buried them both on the same gray morning and sworn he'd never again have anything a man could take from him. He had exactly one debt in the world he could never repay, and it belonged to a man he'd never even learned the name of until 3 weeks ago when that man died and left the debt standing in his front yard. "You'd best come in," Nate said, and hated the sound of his own voice saying it. She ate like she hadn't eaten in 2 days, because she hadn't. He fed her cold biscuit and beans he warmed on the stove, and he did not ask questions until she'd finished, because he'd learned once, a long time ago, that you let a starving person eat before you make them talk. "You didn't ask me anything about myself," she said afterward. "Most women in your position, showing up to marry a man they've never met, they'd want to know things. Whether he drinks, whether he's got a temper." "My father told me who you were," Nora said simply. "He said the man who pulled him out of a flood without knowing his name and never once came looking for a reward was a man worth trusting with his daughter's life. I decided I could live with the rest." Nate looked away first. "I'm not going to marry a stranger over a debt that isn't even mine," he said. "I'll give you money, I'll give you a horse, I'll ride you to the territorial capital myself if that's what it takes to get you clear of this prat." "He'll find me," Nora said quietly. "He's got men who ride for him in every town between here and the capital. A woman traveling alone with no name attached to her, she's easy to find and easier to take. But a married woman," she looked up at him, "a married woman is protected under the law in a way a homeless one never will be. I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Calloway. I'm asking you to be a name on a piece of paper that Josiah Pratt can't argue with." Nate didn't sleep that night. He lay on the floor by the banked fire and thought about a river 7 years gone, and a debt he'd carried like a stone in his chest ever since, with no earthly way to set it down. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, he understood that the stone had just been handed back to him in the shape of a living, breathing woman asleep in his loft, and that there was only one way left to pay it. In the morning, he told her yes, on his terms. A marriage in name only, her own room once he built it. She'd earn her keep, same as any hand on the place, because he didn't take charity and wouldn't offer it either, and she was never, under any circumstance, to mistake this for something it wasn't. "I understand completely," Nora said, and something in the way she said it told him she meant to hold him to every word of it, including the parts he hadn't said out loud, about never letting it become more. They rode to the preacher in Cedar Hollow that same afternoon. The town went quiet when they rode in, the particular quiet of a place deciding what it thinks of you before you've said a single word. A loudmouth named Hollis Tate planted himself in the road and made a show of it, grinning up at Nora with the kind of look that Nate's hands go still and dangerous at his sides. Nate didn't hit him. He'd learned long ago that a man who throws the first punch in a small town hands that town its story, and he wasn't interested in being anybody's story. He just stepped in close, quiet and level, and told Hollis Tate that the woman on that horse would be his wife inside the hour, and every insult aimed at her from here on was an insult aimed at him. Hollis found something else to do with his mouth besides talk. The preacher, an old man who'd married and buried half the county and stopped being surprised by any of it decades ago, asked them only the questions the law required, and not one more. He took Nora's cold hand and put it in Nate's steady one, and said the words that would make her a wall the law itself couldn't knock down. Nate said, "I do," to a spot on the wall just past the preacher's shoulder, because he found he couldn't quite say it looking at her. They rode back up the mountain married, and barely spoke for the first hour, until Nora broke the silence sideways, the way he'd learned she broke most silences. "You said I do to the wall," she said, "not to me, not once." "I was concentrating," Nate said, "on not making a mistake." He felt, rather than heard, the small sound she made behind him, not quite a laugh. What he hadn't braced for was that Nora Ashworth could actually work. He found it out the second morning, when he came to the corral and found her already up on the rail, watching the one horse on the place nobody could ride, a big gray gelding he half decided to sell for whatever he could get, because an unrideable horse is just an expensive way to feed flies. "Get down from there," Nate said. "That one's dangerous." "He's not dangerous," Nora said, not moving. "He's scared. There's a difference, and it matters a great deal to the horse." She tilted her head. "Watch how he keeps his offside turned away from you. Somebody hurt him on that side once, and now he won't give it to a soul. You've been fighting him for months, haven't you?" Nate stopped walking. "How do you know that?" "Because you called him dangerous. Men call a horse dangerous when the horse has beaten them." She climbed down slow, careful to stay in the animal's good eye the whole way, and held out one hand, palm low, and waited. Didn't move toward him at all, just waited. "My father surveyed land his whole life," she said quietly, not to Nate anymore. "He used to say a man who reads a river wrong drowns in it, and a man who reads a horse wrong gets thrown by it. Everything's got a language, if you're patient enough to learn it." The gray's ears came forward. His off eye rolled white, and then, slow, he turned his head, and for the first time in 8 months, gave a human being his blind side on purpose. Nate watched his own unrideable horse lower its head into a stranger's hand, and felt something turn over in his chest he didn't have a name for, and didn't especially want one. That was how the first 2 weeks went. Not in words, in small things laid down carefully, one at a time, like stones set across a creek, so a person could cross it without getting swept off. She found the ledger he'd been keeping, which wasn't a ledger at all, just a cigar box of receipts and a great deal of hoping. And by lamplight, over 3 nights, she found that the feed supplier in town had been overcharging him for years, cheerfully to his face. She wrote the letters herself. He only had to sign them. "That's the thing my father taught me I'm actually good at," she said, sliding the corrected numbers across the table. "Anybody can add. I can find." And Nate, watching her across the lamp, understood he was looking at a woman who just remembered for the first time in weeks that she was good at something. He told himself the warmth in his chest was pride at a good hire. He told himself that for exactly 11 more days. The first sign that the mountain wasn't far enough came 2 weeks after the wedding. Nate rode down to Cedar Hollow alone for supplies and found the storekeeper unusually quiet, unusually careful with his eyes. A man had been in 3 days back, the storekeeper said. City clothes, good boots, the soft-handed kind. Asked after a Nathaniel Calloway. Asked whether it was true he'd married recent. Asked where the bride had come from. Told him nothing, the storekeeper said. But Calloway, I wasn't the only man he asked, and this town's got mouths. Nate rode home hard, and by the time the cabin came in sight, his jaw was set like stone, and Nora was out of the corral and had the gate open before he'd even reined in. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, a demand. He told her the truth, all of it, because he'd learned already that shading it for her comfort would only be its own kind of insult to a woman who'd walked 2 days on nothing but her own nerve to reach his door. "He knows a name and a town," Nora said, and the color went out of her face, but she didn't stagger. "That's all he needs. He'll come himself now." Men like him always want to see the thing with their own eyes. 3 days later, the letter came, carried up the mountain by a boy on a paid pony who wouldn't get closer than the edge of the yard. 1 page in a fine, educated hand. "Mr. Calloway, I understand you've recently married a young woman formerly of my acquaintance, the daughter of the late Thomas Ashworth, who died owing me a considerable sum. I am given to understand the figure was $600. I write to inform you that in taking Miss Ashworth as your wife, you have taken her father's debt as your own, as the law allows. I will call upon you within the week to discuss terms. J. Pratt." 600, Nora whispered, and her hands went to fists. "My father owed him 200. I held the note myself. He's tripled it because he thinks a dead man can't argue and a grieving daughter won't dare." "He's not coming to collect a debt," Nate said, reading it a second time, his voice gone flat and hard. "He's coming to collect land. He wants that canyon spring on your father's homestead, and if I can't pay 600 I don't have, he takes the ground instead. That's the whole play." He folded the letter and put it inside his coat, over his heart. "We can't sit up here and wait for him," Nora said. "If we wait, he wins by default. We have to move first." "Move where?" Nate said. "He owns the judge in this county. He owns half the badges. There's no fighting a man like that on his own ground with nothing but our word against his." Nora was quiet a moment, and then something came into her face, the same look she'd worn standing at that corral rail, patient and unhurried and entirely certain. "My father was a surveyor," she said slowly. "He filed every boundary claim in this county for 15 years before he got sick. And there's something he told me once, near the end, that I didn't understand until right now. They found Micah Alvarez 2 days later at the freight yard on the county line, a lean, hard-used young man in his 20s, whose family had lost their grazing land to Josiah Pratt 4 years back over a boundary dispute that never should have gone the way it went. His father, like Nora's, had signed papers he trusted a rich man to read honestly to him. He hadn't. "You're Ashworth's girl," Micah said the moment he saw her, and something raw moved across his face. "Your father surveyed the line between my family's land and Pratt's Segred the year before we lost it. He came out and re-walked the whole boundary himself, on his own time, because he said the numbers on file didn't sit right with him." Micah's jaw worked. 2 weeks later, he told my father, real quiet, that somebody had moved the boundary markers. Not on paper, in the ground.
Moved the actual iron stakes 40 yards onto our land, then filed new coordinates at the county land office to match. My father went to the sheriff. The sheriff worked for Pratt. Nothing ever came of it. Nora went very still. "He never told me that part." "Your father kept his own set of true survey numbers," Micah said. "Every job he ever did, official file and his own private notebook both, because he told my father once he'd learned the hard way that a man's memory outlasts whatever gets filed at the county office when the county office is bought and paid for." "Where's his notebook?" Nate said. "Gone," Nora said quietly. "Burned, most likely, with the rest of his papers when the fever took him, and I had to sell what I could and leave the rest. I never thought to look for it before I ran." Her eyes came up, bright and fierce. "But if he filed the true numbers with anyone else, if there's a second set of records anywhere that shows Pratt's stakes don't match his own filed claims, there's a copy," Micah said slowly. "There has to be. Territorial land law requires an independent county registrar to keep duplicate survey filings for exactly this reason, so no one man's book can be the only book. If your father filed the true boundary the year he walked my family's line, there's a legal copy sitting in the county land registry office right now, in Cedar Hollow, in a drawer nobody's ever bothered to check because nobody's ever had a reason to look." "Pratt owns that office," Nate said. "Pratt owns the registrar," Micah said. "He doesn't own the clerk. There's a woman there, Agnes Doyle. She's kept those files for 11 years and hates that man with everything left in her. Lost her own family's homestead to him the same way mine went. She's been waiting a long time for somebody to ask her for help instead of a favor." Agnes Doyle met them 2 nights later in the back room of the freight yard cook's little house, and when she saw Nora's face, something in her own broke open. "I filed those duplicates myself," she said, once Nora had explained. "I remember your father, Miss Ashworth. Nora, if I may. Careful man, honest man, the kind his county's had precious few of." Her hands trembled on the table. "I've stood in that records room for 11 years watching that man rewrite boundary lines like they were his to invent, and I never once had proof solid enough to hand a federal officer instead of a county judge who answers to him. If your father's true numbers are in that drawer, will you help us get to it?" Nora said. Agnes was quiet a long moment. "Thursday," she said finally. "Pratt rides to the county seat every Thursday evening to dine with the judge, takes half his men with him. The registry office closes at 6, but I hold the only other key. I can be there past dark, alone, with the excuse of catching up on filing." Her chin came up, and something like 11 years of swallowed anger finally found its way to the surface. "I'll leave the side door unlatched. You come after dark. You find your father's true filing, and God help me, we finish this." Thursday came the way a held breath finally lets go. Nora and Nate went the last half-mile on foot, through the dark, toward the one lit window at the back of the county registry office. Micah waited with the wagon on the county road, a false bottom already built beneath a load of freight. "In and out," Nate said at the door, holding her by the arm one last time. "If you hear me whistle, you run for that wagon and you don't stop for anything, promise me." "I promise," Nora said. "I didn't walk 2 days to your door to lose my nerve 2 feet from the finish." She slipped through the side door into the gold light, where Agnes was already waiting, already pulling open the long, flat drawer of duplicate filings, already running her finger down years of dates until she stopped on one from 4 years back. Ashworth T. Boundary Resurvey. Alvarez/Pratt parcel line. Nora's hands shook as she unfolded it. Her father's handwriting, small and careful and exact, showing the true boundary 40 yards from where Pratt's filed claim placed it. And beneath it, a second sheet, one Nora hadn't expected when her father must have added the same week for a case she'd never heard of. Ashworth T. Boundary Resurvey. Ashworth Homestead/Pratt Canyon Line. Her own family's land.
Her father had quietly resurveyed his own boundary against Pratt's the same year and found the same thing. The canyon spring, the one spring Pratt wanted most in the whole county, sat legally on Ashworth land, no matter how Pratt's filed maps tried to claim otherwise. He knew, Nora breathed. My father knew for years that Pratt was after that spring, and he made sure the truth was filed somewhere Pratt could never burn it. That was when they heard the horses.
Fast, coming from the county seat, far earlier than any Thursday card game should end, and a voice riding easy over the top of them, smooth even at a gallop. Faster, gentlemen. I have a feeling we've got guests tonight. Nate didn't whistle. A whistle would send Nora running straight out into a yard about to fill with riders. He swallowed it down and stepped out from the shadow of the building into the open street, rifle raised, and put a shot into the dark over their heads. That's far enough, Pratt. The riders hauled up in a chaos of dust and screaming horses, and out of the middle of it came Josiah Pratt's voice, gone tight and furious. Calloway, on my land, in the dark. Your land, Nate called back, already moving 3 steps sideways so the muzzle flash wouldn't mark him. Funny word for it, seeing as the true boundary of that canyon spring sat filed and legal in this county's own record books for 4 years, 40 yards inside Thomas Ashworth's line, same as the Alvarez parcel you moved the stakes on before it. Seems you've been building an empire on ground that was never yours to begin with. The silence that followed was total. You're bluffing, Pratt said, but the crack in it was already showing. Go ahead and call it that in front of a federal land commissioner, Nate said. I'll wait. And in that silence, the precious silence Nate had bought with a bullet and a handful of true words, the side door of the registry office opened without a sound, and Nora Ashworth slipped out into the dark, with her father's filings pressed flat against her chest, Agnes right behind her, hour at a stretch, the filings never once out of Nora's hands, and laid them on the desk of a federal land commissioner who had never dined at Josiah Pratt's table and did not care in the slightest how many badges the man owned 3 counties away. It took him one night to confirm what Thomas Ashworth had quietly proven 4 years before he ever knew it would matter: a documented pattern of moved boundary markers, falsified filings, and a canyon spring stolen from a dying man's daughter in broad daylight and dressed up as a lawful debt. They rode back into Cedar Hollow behind a federal marshal 2 weeks later, and the town that had gone silent and suspicious the day Nate Calloway rode in with a stranger on his horse now lined the street to watch the richest man in 3 counties let out of his own bank in irons. Nora insisted on paying her father's actual debt, the real $200, not Pratt's invented $6, out of the first good year the ranch had, because it was honest, and her father had signed it meaning to pay it, and a debt honestly owed was one she'd never leave sitting. The canyon spring came back to the Ashworth homestead, and to Nora, free and clear and legally hers for the first time in her life. And a year to the day after a stranger had walked 2 days up a mountain and said 2 words that stopped a lonely rancher's heart cold, Nate Calloway stood at the corral fence and watched his wife gentle a young horse in the early light, patient and unhurried, letting the animal come to her hand the way she always did, the way he understood now she'd done with him from the very first morning. "You've got that look again," Nora called across the paddock without turning around. "The one you had the day you said 'I do' to the wall instead of to me." "I'm not looking at the wall this time," Nate said. She came and leaned against the fence beside him, her shoulder against his, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, because after a year, neither of them needed to. "Your father didn't hand me a debt when he pulled me out of that river," Nate said finally. "I carried it 7 years, thinking it was a stone I'd never set down. Turns out it was the only thing in the world that could have given me my life back." "Then stop calling it a debt," Nora said, and smiled the smile he'd fall asleep to for the rest of his life. 2 people who'd both decided they had nothing left to lose walked into each other's lives and found out they were wrong. That's not a debt, Nate. That's just 2 people who stopped being alone at the exact same time. And Nathaniel Calloway, who had sworn 7 years earlier that he would never again have anything worth losing, drew his wife in against him at the fence in the clean morning light, and knew, with a certainty he had never once felt in all those years of having nothing, that he was exactly where he was meant to be.